Hello and a very warm welcome to you. I'm Natalie MacDonald and you're watching another Sydney Direct. The GST debate has reared its head once again in Australian politics, and while Abbott's government claimed that an extension of GST to incorporate fresh food could raise the government's $6 billion in revenue, I met with Nicki Hutley of Urbis Group to discuss what this could mean for the agricultural and retail sectors. Nicki, Happy New Year. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Great to be here, thanks.
Okay, so GST has swung around again in Australian politics. What has brought it up this time really, and is there anything different?
Well, I think the urgency of it, if there is one, is that we are in a situation where our budget position is becoming more and more deteriorating. And over time, we're worried because, like most nations, we have an ageing population, a declining workforce as a percentage of that population. So we've got to do something if we're going to long-term deal with that structural deficit. And obviously, the GST is an important part of perhaps looking at how you broaden a tax base.
Now, the Abbott government stands to gain approximately $6 billion should it extend GST to cover fresh food. The OECD have encouraged Australia to rethink its tax strategy. With a government that has a bit of a revenue problem, this seems like quite the solution, really.
Look, it is one solution, but my position is that we need to really understand in Australia what do we want from our taxation and how do we want to spend the revenues that we get, because there are lots of variations across the world. You have high taxing countries such as particularly the Scandinavian countries, but they also have very high levels of social security, probably and social support measures, probably somewhere where Australia doesn't want to go. But we still haven't quite worked that out as a nation, and it's really not quite right to be talking about the tax mix until we know what it is that we want that to do and how much we need to collect.
And that does sort of bring us on to the negatives of the idea. Farmers are arguing that the costs are going to get pushed onto them and ultimately onto the consumer. How could this therefore change the relationship between perhaps the agriculture sector and the retail sector?
Look, I think the agricultural sector's fears are unfounded. They're worried that any margin pressure will get put back on them, and I can understand that given the experience they've had, particularly with the big retailers really pushing them and squeezing them on price. But ultimately, a GST is about a consumer paying the price, about a consumer making the decision whether they save or spend in fact, and so that they get a greater proportion of their income in their hands, and what they do with it, whether they choose to pay that tax or not, is their decision. They're the ones that will deal with it. And look, over 150 countries around the world have some form of GST valuated tax. It's a very standard form, and the world doesn't fall apart. You have temporary hiccups when you introduce it or raise it, as we saw in Japan recently, but it really, as long as the overall tax mix is okay and is fair and reasonable, then it's not going to make people unduly worse off. We do need, though, to protect, obviously, the lowest income earners. It is a regressive tax, so if everyone's paying 10% on their food and poorer people pay a higher percentage of or spend a higher percentage on food, then they're going to pay more. So we do need to have a bit of compensation, which, of course, complicates things.
Well, exactly that. As you said, Australia wouldn't be the first country to consider broadening or raising GST. What are some other examples that we have of countries that have acted in such a way to economic profit?
Well, I think probably closest to home is New Zealand, which, 20 or so years ago, economically was a bit of a basket case, really. And one of the big structural changes they had here was a complete rethink about the way they imposed their tax base, and they cut income tax, cut corporate taxes and broadened the tax base. So they have a 15% GST, which at the time obviously seemed like a lot, but is now considered to be absolutely normal. And it is actually when you're looking at tax policy, you're looking at what's equitable, what's transparent, what works best, what's most fair across the tax base of collecting. And there are problems with equity with the GST if you don't give the right sorts of adjustments perhaps to the income tax base and tax more highly. But as a means of capturing those that were avoiding tax, which is one of the key reasons it was brought in Australia, it is an absolute perfect tax. It's very transparent and very difficult to avoid.
Nicki, thank you so much for sharing your comments on this today, and we look forward to hearing from you more throughout the year.
Thanks very much.
Lots of key points raised there by Nicki Hutley at Urbis. Many thanks for you for viewing. I'll be back next time with plenty more exclusive interviews right here from Sydney, Australia. For now though, it's goodbye.